Manish Sabharwal of Teamlease joins us. Manish, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I always look forward to our interactions. So I'm going to start with the first question, Mr. Sabharwal, which is where we left last time. When we interacted with you last time, you were of the view that, look, Nikunj, there is no template which will tell you what will happen to economy and what will happen to jobs because the world has not seen a scenario like this. But now that things are improving on the margin, what is your view? Where is the economy headed? Where is job creation headed? I'm sure you must have done your numbers and by now you must have discovered a template also.
No, I think that there is real pain. 3 lakh crores in GST shortfall, 3 lakh crores in coming NPAs, and the 25% close to GDP contraction. But my sense is how countries, how companies, and how investors sort of balance the next quarter and next quarter century is really now becoming the key, right? As we talked about choices, our choices must reflect our hopes rather than our fears. And so far, I mean, the fear is obviously going to be there till the virus goes away. So till we know whether we are at the start, middle, or end of the virus, nobody knows. Demand what is hard to model, and obviously many professions can't be done with social distancing. So I think the planet and countries and companies and individuals are reaching the point where we will be forced to trade off the short term and the long term. Companies who you can panic. I think in a crisis, calmness is power. And so there are clearly two camps which the world is being divided in terms of responses. One is saying we're in the ICU, do triage and take short-term measures, which the policy equivalent is borrow 10 lakh crores from your grandchildren and throw it from helicopters. My sense is, I think that may not be, we are still not, I think that would be a mistake for a country like India. I mean, the US fiscal deficit this year is more than India's GDP. I mean, their fiscal deficit is 3.2 trillion, but they are the world's reserve currency and stuff. So I would submit that the short term continues to be unmodelable. But since there is a light at the end of the tunnel now is the time for companies, countries, and individuals to balance that short-term panic and fear with hope and sort of, change is a form of hope. Hope is not a strategy, I believe that. So I think that companies are now starting to look ahead. And I think as a country, we will have to decide whether we listen to the shrill voice of some economists who say, borrow 10 lakh crores and throw it from helicopters, or we say, no, we will create climate change for entrepreneurs. This is a passing shower, and we will do the labor reform, education reform, compliance reform, banking reform, and all the pending reforms which have been there for a long time.
I like to encourage you to talk about work at home or not work at home. You've got the RPG group which is saying work at home should be adopted. They have announced it. Anand Mahindra last week said work at home is more like a double-edged sword. You got in TCS who's planning to move 75% of the employees to work at home, and then on the other side you've got Tech Mahindra, which is not really completely clear on where things are moving. How is the economy shaping? Because if work at home is going to be implemented, then that will change the dynamics of productivity, cost, SG&A. There are a lot of changes will happen depending on what individual corporates and individual CEOs are likely to adopt as a delivery or as a style of working.
For 10% of the labor force. 90% of the labor force can't work from home. I always like to preface this because some of the work at home Ayatollahs extrapolate, the cognitive elite extrapolate their life to everybody's life. If you work with your hands and legs, you can't work from home. So 90% of the labor force is excluded from this debate. So it's nice for us to work at home because we can outsource the dangers of the virus to people who work as delivery boys or as policemen or as farmers, which these are jobs which can't be done from home. So let's first of all frame the debate is that we are only talking about 10% of the labor force. Second, let's frame the debate as how many people have broadband at home, which is less than 5%. How many people have a separate room at home, which is less than 5%. And also, I think the cognitive elite, as I am hearing, are getting tired because working from home has become living at work. There are no partitions, there are no pauses, there are no transitions. And I'm not sure that's good for mental health. So historians always, journalism is the first draft of history, but, historians always warn against a disease called presentism, which is believing that today's circumstances are so special, so unique, and they are permanent. I think, we must be a little calmer about the benefits of coming together in person. An argument against offices is an argument against cities. New York's GDP is more than Russia. I think the chances of you being more productive and lucky by working in Palo Alto or New York are much higher than being born in Moscow or in Kanpur. And so I think that there is work from home. What will happen at the end of this is that flexibility will increase. We could never have run a randomized control trial. So prior to COVID, about 5% of the cognitive elite used to work from home. Post-COVID, maybe 15, 20%. I think IT is interesting, but IT is 4 million people out of India's labor force of 550 million. So yes, IT will go from 4 million to 8 million people in total employment. And maybe, 25, 40% of that will have the flexibility to work from home. But I think when you start hearing the second order effects of working from home, whiteboarding sessions, creativity, lateral vision, young people. I mean, it's horrible to be a management trainee. So working from home is a tax on the poor. It seems to be a tax on the young. And it seems to work for a certain class of workers. I think that class of workers is a minority in this country among our labor force. Among the cognitive elite, it's a different argument.
Mr. Sabharwal, if I look at the anecdotal evidence which has been presented by, let's say, auto companies or consumer durable companies, or for that matter, consumer discretionary companies, all of them are saying that, look, we are back to 80 to 85% of our pre-COVID levels. Some of them are even claiming that we are back to almost pre-COVID levels. If the contraction in the economy is so real, and we all know the problems are there on the job front, the economy front, on the unemployment front, why is economy coming back? I mean, given the kind of GDP growth and other factors which are at play, the consumer demand should have got punctured and should have remained low. But it's quite encouraging to see the ability of the consumer to surprise us and to hold up.
I mean, I think we have to distinguish between a rebound and recovery. Rebound reflects the stock effect. We had 3 months of zero activity. So there was a stock depletion in FMCG. There was a stock depletion in many areas. So I would submit again, my view of the world is we overestimate what we can do in the short run and underestimate what we can do in the long run. So this current recovery, which we see, is obviously encouraging, and we all need hope to cope. The only antidote to fear is hope. But I think we need to be careful with believing that this is somehow represents a change. I think obviously 25% GDP contraction cannot be extrapolated to the rest of the year. The second quarter had many more factories online, and the third quarter is going to see life return to normal. But there is no question that there are no jobs in this country which are COVID-proof. There are no companies which are COVID-proof. There are some sectors where you see a blunting of COVID's impact, and there are very few digital learning, e-commerce, where you've seen a massive sort of super cycle of digitization. But on the whole, COVID does represent a natural disaster. And I think that we need to live in hope, but we need to be careful, because hysteresis, which is what labor market economists worry about when demand is low, so people lose skills, people lose connectivity to the job market. I don't think we're at hysteresis yet. But I do think some of them are being frugal. Everybody is reacting differently to this crisis. So I would say that there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel. In June, there was a light at the end of the tunnel that turned out to be an incoming train. So let's be careful. But I don't think this is climate change. I think it's a passing shower, and we are all in the same storm. We're not in the same boat. We've talked about this before. Some industries are gaining, some states are gaining, some individuals are gaining, some professions are gaining. Education, healthcare, agriculture, and IT clearly have not been as impacted as, say, hospitality or construction or sales. But that doesn't mean companies within those sectors have very different outcomes. So the noise to signal ratio will continue to be distorted till we know whether we are at the start end of this vaccine. Let's look at this fast data, which everybody has started looking at. But there's a reason statisticians warn against fast data, because they often turn out to be sampling errors.
Sure. According to one of your recent reports as well, that super specialized job profiles seem to be an emerging trends. Are there particular cities or a cross section of geographies where you're finding this, assuming a dominance?
I mean, it's obviously the clusters of where the job magnets are, right? I mean, India has 52 cities with more than 1 million people out of our 4,000. So clearly those 52 gaining. But obviously places like Pune, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Gurgaon are the places where more widely spread. But those are sort of not at the higher end kind of jobs. So I think, yes, cognitive workers whose ability to work from home and whose demand has not been shrunk by COVID are obviously, I don't think they're gainers yet, but I think they've been less hurt by COVID. So I'd say that the usual suspects, a strong hand becomes stronger as a city, as an industry, and as a company, and probably as individuals too, right? We're all making more withdrawals from our social capital than we are making deposits. And so people with existing skills and relationships are obviously taking more advantage of the COVID than people who are just entering the labor force or who are labor market outsiders.
Mrs. Sabharwal, this entire thought which everybody has that, okay, every economy is going to become a knowledge-based economy, it's going to be built on digital, it's going to be only centered around AI, automation, digitization, robotics. You think there is fault in this argument? Because, I mean, you still need a world to utilize and sectors who will consume these services.
Yeah. See, I have studied every report in the world. There are about 50 of them over the last 50 years, which project where jobs will be in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. There was US in 1990, UK in 2020, Japan in... I mean, they all have the efficacy of palm reading or astrology, right? The ability of economists or anybody to predict exactly where jobs will be in the future is quite low. 50% of the jobs created in the US in every decade since the 1960s did not exist in the decade before that. That said, I think there is a digitalization supercycle. I think we are entering capitalism without capital. You know, most new economy companies need much less capital than they used to be. The employment elasticity of manufacturing is coming down. Employment is shifting from a lifetime contract to a taxi cab relationship. Education is shifting from knowing to learning, you know, in a world where Google knows everything. So I don't actually believe we can't predict the future. We can make ourselves worthy of the future as countries, as companies, and as individuals. So I would say that, yes, I would say that the decline of uh, jobs, the decline of cities, the decline of organizations, the decline of offices, it may be premature to call that, and it may be too extremist to call that, right? You know, in this kind of crisis, you know, what we should be is too moderate for the radicals and too radical for the moderates. Yes, change is coming, so let's not defend the status quo, but you know, change takes 20, 30 years. If you study a great book by Technological Revolutions by Caroletta Perez, almost all technology revolutions take more time than we think. So I think if your constituents are people who are currently in the labor market, yes, they need to be careful of changes at the margin, but the world takes much longer to change. That doesn't mean that the world is not changing, but it's we have a very low ability to predict the future, is what history tells us.
Mr. Sabharwal, you're a voracious reader, and each time I interact with you, you know, I get ideas of what is the next thing I should read. I'm sure our viewers also get that idea. So let me ask you a question, which is an easy question for you. If you have to, let's say, recommend a list of 3 or 4 books, which according to you, everyone should read, not once, but again and again, where would the list start and where would the list end?
Oh, I think that it's a very hard question because it depends on the weather of the moment. But I think, you know, currently probably India After Gandhi is an important, by Ram Guha, is an important book to realize that if you think India's problems are high right now, I mean, they were much bigger in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we have built the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. I think we can build the world's largest economy. So India After Gandhi just gives us hope that challenges can be overcome. I'd say The History of Strategy by Lawrence Friedman is one of my favorite books. we face uncertainty right now, and strategy is always about uncertainty. And so I found that book particularly sort of refreshing. But in my mind, I think currently there are a number of books which talk about this balance between short term and long term. And I just ran into a wonderful book by Jonas Sachs. He was the inventor of the polio vaccine. And he always used to say the most important question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And I think that is really the most important question today for companies and for countries. We can easily panic and, steal 10 lakh crores from our grandchildren and, throw it from helicopters, or as companies, we can starve our brand investments or tech investments or people investments, and people will not notice it, but it will come back to bite us. So I would say, currently the framing of the challenge as balancing the next quarter and next quarter century is probably the way we should be thinking about it as boards, as companies, and even as central banks and as fiscal policymakers.
Well, fantastic. Always a pleasure to have you on ET Now, and thank you. Always a pleasure to have you on ET Now, and thank you for your wonderful insights. Stay safe, and certainly hope to see much more of you going forward.
Take care. Thank you.